A lot of people who've been through treatment for years and not seen a lot of success that come here and pretty quickly are different people because this isn't a traditional treatment setting. The value proposition for me when I got sober was basically like, okay, you can give up the only thing that's ever made you feel okay in your own skin in exchange for sobriety, which is what you're trying to avoid in the first place. Men that turn 40 that don't have a sense of purpose kill themselves a lot. This is an opportunity to learn about myself because there's a reason I chose this path. And the reason is that the value proposition seemed better at the time that I took it. It's not about how do you create a life without conflict or a life where circumstances don't happen. It's a question of like, when those things come, who is going to show up to that? You've got one stab at this thing, this strange, curious, magical, terrible gift of life. You got one shot at it.
Hello, I am B. Reeves with New Waters Recovery in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to our weekly podcast, Finding New Waters. Our goal in creating Finding New Waters is to provide a resource for families to help navigate the complexities of supporting a loved one struggling with substance use or mental health. When we find ourselves in crisis due to one of these issues, most people have no idea where to turn. We hope to shed some light onto what is often the darkest hour for many families. Thank you. All right, we are super excited to have Jeremy French from Making Whole up in Asheville today. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Well, I am not going to try to, even though I've been to Making Whole several times, known clients who have been there. We have mutual friends and I want to hear all about your lunch, but I'm not going to try to explain what Making Whole is. I would like for you to do that. So I'm not even going to try. Please tell everybody what you do.
This isn't easy to explain. It's not an easy place to explain. What it is on the face is this is an apprenticeship program for men who are recovering from drug addiction, and we build furniture. And that's what it is on the face. It's a traditional apprenticeship program. So rather than the way most education happens around craft in this country today is it's technique building. The old apprenticeships are more where you kind of shadow somebody that knows what they're doing and follow the projects. So that's the kind of apprenticeship it is. We have a wood shop, steel, metal shop, and an architectural concrete shop that we work out of. And we build furniture that goes around the country, a lot here in Asheville, but also gets shipped all over the place. And guys learn how to build things. They learn a new set of problem solving skills. We do, like you mentioned, we have a big family style meal for lunch every day that's open to anybody that wants to join us. So one of the guys will cook lunch for us here every day. And that's what it is on the face. It's what the undercurrent of it is something quite different, where what we're trying to do is just create an intimate environment for men to find a new way to solve problems. So I could sit here, we could blow this whole podcast talking about what it is, but I imagine we want to talk about something else.
But I, when I remember the first time I went to lunch at Making Whole, and I was new to the field. I'd only been sober about 2 years, and I just remember thinking, this is really wild. This is very, very interesting. And then not long after that, we had a guy, who had come to the program, one of the programs I was working for at the time. Maybe it might have been when I was only working for one. And the guy just had been in and out of treatment and couldn't stay sober through traditional modalities and traditional treatment, and came to you. And then, a year later, he's still with you and doing great. And this was not through just sitting in group 3 times a day and listening to a therapist. This was by working with his hands and working with others and working with you and being an apprentice and learning some, to have some success, little tiny pieces of success, kind of 1 second at a time. And from what I understand, it's just, I don't think everybody who goes there fits that bill, but it sounds like it's a great fit for people who have just not been successful in traditional treatment. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah. We've had a lot of people here who would be categorized as treatment resistant. A lot of people who've been through treatment for years and not seeing a lot of success that come here and pretty quickly are different people because this isn't a traditional treatment setting. I think a lot of what we're doing here, what you learn in treatment, if we think about what the treatment cycle is, it's, 30, 60, 90 days long. And what's happening during that period of time is that you're getting pumped full of lots of information about who you are and about what you needed to do. And then it's on the individual to go out and put that to practice in the world, which is kind of a tall order, particularly when somebody's not entirely convinced that there's a value to doing that. And so that's that's most of what treatment can provide because treatment's such a short period of time in the context of the problem that we're trying to solve in addiction, which is a long haul recovery process. And so what's happening here is that this is the place where you actually just put it into practice. And so while in a lot of treatment settings, you can hide out during the period of time where you're in front of somebody. You can't hide out for 8 hours a day at work. You're going to get found out. What you actually believe is going to show up. And so what ends up happening is your sort of coping skills and manipulation skills to hide out in the world get rendered useless because you're around people who are in the same boat 8 hours a day. And not only are you around them, you're having to engage and work and decide who you want to be. And that exercise, all the things we learn have to become an exercise for them to become valuable. And the exercise, one of the values of this place is that you don't have to decide on your own, oh, that's a valuable exercise. That's something I want to put into practice. Now let me go out into the world as it is and figure out a way to put that into practice. The exercise here is you're given an opportunity to do that. And you don't have to go through that sort of cognitive effort to decide that that's what you want to do. And if you do that for long enough, we know what we know about habits is you do something for, 60, 90 days and it becomes a habit. If you stick around in a place where you're getting challenged into that exercise daily, it's going to impact you. What the outcome is a big sticky subject from here. But when we look back through the role of who's been here, nobody leaves here without being impacted, without being a different person. That's not necessarily speaking to the value of this place. It's just not possible to go to a place for a year and not leave as a different human being.
Yeah, it's such a great point too about hiding out in group and traditional treatment. I know when I first got a treatment because I didn't want to be there, I definitely hid out in group, and eventually I kind of, opened up because I felt like I wanted some change. But people can totally do that, even if they do quote unquote participate in group. It could be just lip service, just to check a box. But if somebody is responsible for a group effort of on some project in your shop or one of your shops, like you said, you're going to get found out if you're not pulling your weight and not and trying to be manipulative and hiding out. Um,
Yes, that's
yeah,
just ends up being what's happening. And I think one of the things in, I think what's not talked about very often around the period of time between somebody in active addiction and not in active addiction, or the period of time between active addiction through treatment back into active addiction, is what's the value proposition that the subject, the person who's addicted, is being offered. And so the value proposition for me when I got sober was basically like, okay, you can give up the only thing that's ever made you feel okay in your own skin in exchange for sobriety, which is what you were trying to avoid in the first place. And so
right.
even though my world was completely destroyed and people didn't want to be around me, I was burning every bridge that was in front of me. Um, I was 125 pounds, where my natural weight should be about 175. I was facing prison time. My world was a mess. And so on the face, I'm intelligent enough to know that when somebody says, okay, it's time to get sober, that I can't look that off because, yeah, there's an intellectual obviousness to that. Your life's a mess. But somewhere beyond my basic, like my conscious ideas, was this other thing that was pulling at me, and it took me a long time to be able to put a finger on that. There's a certain amount of shame when you basically, cuss out your grandparents to then be like, yeah, but I'm not ready to get sober. And so that shame, you kind of want to pretend like, well, yeah, this is who I am is terrible. I don't want to do this anymore. There's shame in not admitting that. But
Yeah.
there's this other thing that I couldn't put a finger on that's like, but I don't want to get sober. And the reason why is because for all that pain, the relief that I got from being high was more that simple. And so one of the things that I know about drug addicts is that we are really efficient at taking stock of what's on the scales and picking the thing that's going to be less painful. And to the outside world, that seems crazy, right? Why would you go back out to doing drugs when you just created that mess you created? But to me, it made perfect sense. This hurts so bad. The relief I'm going to get now is going to be greater. And so because collectively we think, like, who wouldn't want to get better when their life is this kind of mess? We don't really consider, well, what are we offering them? What's the offer? And so that was my offer. You can give up the only thing that's made you feel okay in your own skin, and you get to exchange it for sobriety and the community that's going to deliver that sobriety is not one you resonate with. And so when I got to treatment, I didn't resonate with the people that were around me. We might share some collective experience, but they weren't people that I felt compelled to move toward. And so it's a tough value proposition. It's not something I thought, yeah, this is what I want to do. And it wasn't until there were people that were better at explaining to me what the actual value proposition was, that I could be free in my own skin and not necessarily feel better, but be free. Like I was really hungry for that. I really wanted to be free. And so when in being here, there's a realism to being at work and being around people where we have a lot more value propositions we can offer in the immediate moment, where people can grow and they can feel a sense of success and a sense of purpose. And what those little sort of daily value propositions do is they hook somebody in long enough to get a little sense of clarity about who they are and what they want. And it puts them on a slightly different path. And so as they get on that path, it's easier then to have a conversation with somebody about who they actually want to be, what they actually want to experience about life. And those are conversations that can happen naturally. They don't have to be scripted. We had one here at lunch yesterday. There's a guy that's his last day is Wednesday, and he's facing up to basically an invitation into adulthood is what he's facing up to. He's got to get a job. He's got to pay rent. He's got to show up in a different way. He's never really had to do that. He's had some of the externalities that come with being an adult, but he's never really been on his own. And he's terrified. And the way he's behaving is not necessarily productive. And so there was kind of a conversation that broke out at lunch that wasn't a therapy session. It wasn't hey, sit down and let everybody tell you what you ought to do. It was a conversation about this moment in life, that people at the table were on different sides of. And so it's a sort of broad conversation that happens naturally that feels organic. And those moments, that's a big part of what I want to try to create is a fertile ground for those moments to happen naturally. And so for me, I got sober and there was probably 10 years of sobriety before I was exposed to some of those conversations with people that I trusted, with people that I wanted what they had, just real conversations about life. And looking back on that, I think to myself, it didn't need to take that long for me to have that conversation. And when I look at who I was following that conversation, um, like my life opened up as a byproduct of those conversations. So part of my question here is, what kind of things do you not have to wait 10 years to get? Now, if you go out into the world and you're just trying to make ends meet, get by, and the people you work with 8 hours a day don't know about your situation, don't care about your situation, they can be well-meaning, but there's no like a direct growth towards recovery, then it takes a decade to, run into those conversations. But what if we have an environment where that's concentrated? Can that generate opportunities for guys to discover who they are faster?
Yeah. First of all, what did you do? What were you doing with your life other than staying sober for those 10 years?
Um, Making messes. I don't know. Doing the best that I could. I was just surviving, making ends
Right.
meet. Trying to figure out how to be a man in a child's mind. To a large
Right.
extent. I got sober young, and I wasn't given a real formal invitation into being a man. I was given lots of little piecemeal invitations at various stages in my life, but nobody ever said like, "Now, welcome to being a man. This is what being a man looks like." I had to kind of piece that together from the world. And so there's a long time in that 10 years where I'm just trying to like make it out of one container of being a child into the container of being an adult. And, the circumstances of that, you can imagine what those were. Some of them were wonderful. Some of them were, I made messes that I didn't necessarily, I don't think I had to make, but I didn't know any other way to do it. But then there's a lot of life in there too. I eventually found a group of people that were really serious about um, the sort of internal work of recovery, and I followed them real closely and did some dramatic work to start to look at myself, understand what was happening inside my mind, understanding the consequences of what was happening inside my mind. And I went on to get married and buy a house and have children and do the things that you do in life. And that was a far cry from where I started.
I hear you. And then tell me about the genesis of making whole. How did that come to be?
So there was two of the guys in my wedding who are now dead. And I got to this stage, this was 2015, where the number of my friends that were dying was like really stark. And it got to the point where some of these guys that I was really close to, and I kind of saw them in the tail end of their life, some of which died from suicide. It seems to be that men that turn 40 that don't have a sense of purpose kill themselves a lot. So I had a string of guys who had kind of like right on the precipice of 40 on either side of that committed suicide, and then a lot of other friends who overdosed. And so I was close with a lot of these guys leading up to their death. And one of the things that struck me is knowing these guys as well as I did is that there is a way to help these dudes. And I don't know where that way exists. And so what would that look like? You know? And I guess the reason why I know that there was a way is because they really wanted to get better. But there was nowhere where the value proposition made any sense to them. That was a place, that's a place I'd go and invest this energy that I have towards wanting to get better to get better. And so I had a family member commit suicide, and there's a story that follows that I won't get into, but had a real impact on me. Who I was as a professional at the time, I'd kind of solved the problems as a professional that I'd set out to solve. And I realized professionally that it was time for me to find a new problem to solve. Because what I know about myself personally is that if like my mind has to have a problem to eat, and if I
Yep.
don't give it one, it's gonna pick one. And the ones it picks are kind of stupid problems to solve. And eventually that becomes problematic. And so in considering all these people who are dying and considering, well, why don't they get better? What would a place look like for them to get better? What I started considering is who do I know that's gotten better? And at this point, this is 2015. I've been sober 20 years at that point. And so I had a list of people. It was not a long list. I've known a lot of people in recovery, and the list of people for whom I would trade the life that I have for the life that they have is a short list. Um, and so the benefit of that is that I know them all well enough to really consider like what makes them all the same, either in who they are or what their experience is. And there were two common factors in every single one of them. One of them is that everybody who falls into that list has the story of a person that impacted them at the beginning, um, that had like a sort of life-changing impact. Something they said, a way they mentored them, the way they showed up for them. Every one of them has a story of somebody at the beginning. The other thing is that every single one of them had made a profession or made a hobby that required active, creative problem solving in their lives. And I think when we use the word creative, a lot of people think about like painting and pipe cleaners, with cotton balls on a piece of paper, whatever, Um, I don't creativity to me is very simply a process. And it's the same basic steps that you would follow in science and in art. This process. I've got a problem. Here's a hypothesis. I'm going to test it out. I'm going to take stock of what the outcomes are. And where creativity exists in that world is that science requires proof and art requires none. And creativity falls somewhere in between, where you're going to need a little bit of proof, but you also have license to kind of like use a little bit of intuition. You have license to take risks that don't require proofs. And so what these creative problem solvers were doing was anything from being craftspeople, makers, creatives, to mothers. There's a lot of mothers, people, not just mother by the fact that they had given birth, but mothers in the sense that they're people that were actively involved in trying to develop their children, that was their principal goal. CEOs, entrepreneurs, these kinds of people who are going to be faced daily with a new set of problems that they had to find a new set of solutions for. And that's where the creative process engages, because I don't have a previous solution for this. I got to go find one. And so all these people had these things for which they were passionate. And what had happened is that they had gone and learned a way to engage life that they then went back and applied to their recovery. It wasn't necessarily the other way around. Like I hear a lot, like, oh, I learned everything in recovery and applied that to life. That's that's not necessarily my experience. My experience is I learned enough in recovery to show up to life. And then what I learned in life, I went back and applied to my personal search to be whole. And so that was the case for everybody. The other thing that had happened is I'd had a studio in one form or fashion for 15 years leading up to that. And every year somebody would come to me and say, working in your shop's what changed my life. The environment of the shop changed my life. And these are guys that showed up to me without teeth, brand new in recovery. The recovery pools, that's who I knew. So that's who I would hire to do the work we were doing. And they would come to me now with a full set of teeth and a PhD and say, working in your shop's what changed my life. And that happened consistently enough to think, well, there's something to that. There's something to that environment if that many people were saying that. And so over the course of a couple of years, this sort of idea grew about basically how do you create an environment where mentors exist? How do you create an environment where creative problem solving is required and taught in sort of an informal sense, not like a school setting? And then how do you attach the things that make life valuable? Like intimacy, community, purpose, time. A big part of the reason why we eat is that I spent a fair bit of time in Europe on work leading up to this, and the way they interface with food over there is just different. And one of the big differences is that they slow down. The places I would go, it would slow down to eat. It wasn't like, hey, we got a 30-minute lunch break, let's do this. It was like, okay, now we get to sit down. And there was no timeline on the end of it. And now we're going to share time together and we're going to share quality food together. And that impacted me a lot. not rushing, taking time. And so those kind of things, as much as I could, I want to figure out a way to create an environment where those things already exist. And then when you bring somebody into that fertile ground, can they grow?
I love that.
So,
And that's such a great point, and something even though I know you do the lunch every day, I didn't realize there was so much purpose behind that, inspired by being in Europe where people do take their meals more seriously and they get to know each other. And like, unlike Americans who typically are always rushed, eating in their office, eating in their cars, whatever. I mean, that's such a great point. I hope I can, if there's, I'm going to take a lot away from this conversation, but hopefully I'm going to take that away too, to actually enjoy my meals with people instead of always being in a rush. Because because one thing, when I got sober, I was probably 3 or 4 months sober, and I went to this meeting that I was starting to go to. And I got there right at noon. It was called Nooners. And, and he said, "Hey, are you chronically late everywhere?" And I said, "No, but I'm chronically barely on time." And he said, "I used to be like that." And what I do is I try to be 15 minutes early everywhere, and that way it takes a lot of stress out of my life. And so I applied that, and I always try to do that. Worst case is typically if I try to be 15 minutes early, then I will be on time. Kind of worst case, I'm almost never late anywhere. And what I realized after a very short amount of time was I could enjoy my shower, my morning prayers and meditation and readings, and my drive to where I'm going, the walk to where I'm going. And those little tiny pockets of stress added up and contributed not only to my lack of serenity, but also by extension my drinking and using before I got sober. And so it's sort of in the same vein as that kind of, lack of a better word, lazy lunch, where people are just sitting around hanging out and getting to know each other. But because the thing is, a meal should be enjoyed. But just in this conversation, I realized that that's something I'm going to work on, because pretty much every time I eat, I'm sitting there with two phones in front of me, looking at the clock, always in a rush, always in a rush. So I'm glad. Thank you for drawing that to my attention inadvertently.
I think one of the big questions I want to ask, and this happened to me when I'd been sober for a while, is what's the fucking point? What's the point?
Right.
And you get to a point in recovery, if you stick around long enough, that question's going to be asked with a certain amount of cynicism. Um, but I don't ask that question with any cynicism. It's like, what am I aiming at? And when I
Right.
consider that purely, that question, and I'll just take economic freedom as an example of that. Why would I aim for economic freedom? There's a reason for that. And what that reason is that I want options. So what all money is stored options. The more stored options I have, the more opportunities I have to be in the world, the more ways I can be in the world. And so there's a sensibility to saying, okay, I need to work towards having economic freedom, which means I need to work, which means I need to do work well, or else they're not going to give me a paycheck. And eventually what happens is, okay, this is the aim. I want to go have economic freedom. Therefore, I want to do all these things that lead up to it. At some stage in life, um, the effort to get the outcome becomes more important than the outcome. And so that, and you don't have to search far in the world today to find people who are just searching for money. And they've got more money than they can spend. They've got more options than they'll spend the rest of their life, but that's still the pursuit. And that's an
Mm-hmm.
example of why, you know,
Mm-hmm.
why is that the aim? And so what's the point is really a question about it. Do I understand what I'm aiming at, and how do I do that? And so for me, the older I get, time with people I care about is really valuable. I really enjoy it. Um, Sort of having a chance to take a break, I really enjoy it. Having work that's purposeful and meaningful to me and challenging to me, I really enjoy it. Having a certain set of problems that feed that monster in my brain that has to consume problems, that's meaningful to me. Being actively curious and remaining curious, that's interesting to me. So if I kind of make a list of things uh, that make life feel purposeful and reconsider, well, what does it take to get that? Do I have to work 90 hours a week to get that? Yes or no? Is there a more direct way to get to the point? Um,
Mhm.
and so when I consider that, it's real easy for me to then look at a life that I've built over a period of time and realize like, oh, geez, like none of this makes sense, because it's like you said about having two phones. I wanted that economic freedom. Therefore, I took a job. I took a job that would seemingly get me there the quickest. And then what the demands of that job became paramount to everything else. And I became a prisoner to doing the work. And being in that prison meant I couldn't enjoy any of the things that I wanted to enjoy. And so there's like life's actually the pleasures we get out of life are actually quite simple and also quite accessible. You don't have to some of the nicest lunches I've ever had didn't cost more than $5 because it wasn't about the food. It was about um, my frame of mind when I was eating, slowing down, looking around, spending time with people. Those things are accessible to anybody. You don't have to be uh, Fortune 500 to get there.
Right. And, we cliche we hear all the time is that life is a journey. We trudge the road of not to happy destiny.
Hmm. Yeah.
But if
And it,
but if on the road the whole time all we do is stress out about every little thing, then are we enjoying the road and the journey?
it's a great
Sometimes
question.
no.
One of the trudge is a beautiful word because it sounds like drudge. And so my instinct is to think, well, it kind of sounds miserable, but it's because I don't know the definitions of a lot of words that I think I do. And one of the definitions of trudge is to walk with purpose, which is a very different idea than drudging. Like, oh, I'm just
Right.
suffering through this thing. It's like walking with purpose. Um, and part of what I like about that idea is that sometimes walking with purpose is not like necessarily easy. It's not a path without resistance. There's resistance in the path, but some of the resistance is what can be what makes it rich. And we think about that in just working out. You go work out. It's like if you find weights that don't have resistance, you're not actually getting any benefit out of it. But there's something about that resistance that at some point when we understand what it is we're aiming at, that resistance and the pain that comes from that is actually part of the joy that you get. It's because you know that you're getting closer to the place that you're aiming at.
Yeah. And just the word willingness, especially, early, it took, I mean, I'm still never cease to amaze me when I'm willing to do something I don't want to do, how much I usually get out of it to the resistance point, and how much I enjoy it. And, um, I, you're bringing up resistance on weights. I've been very bad about going to the gym lately. And that's, another thing I hope to take away from this. And, cause what we really have is a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition, and exercise is a big part of that for me. And so right now, life is, well, my life from the inside out is pretty good right now, but that's something that is lacking. It's kind of like that, the whack-a-mole thing with the problems. I also usually have one little thing that I'm not quite doing right for my spiritual condition.
Yeah. Well, I'm in a meditation right now. There's a certain um, sort of annual renewing of my vows to life at this time of the sort of tail end of summer. The tail end of summer and the tail end of winter, where things just kind of get tough physically. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and in that renewing of my vows, like why am I showing up to things the way I'm showing up to things? How do I want to show up to things? Um, I invariably find that there's things that I'm not doing as I would like to.
Yeah.
One of the licenses I've given myself in time is that that's okay. That's not a bad thing. Failure is a absolutely necessary thing to success. If you read a book about a successful person and it's the journey towards their success, it's 9 chapters about failing. And
Right.
then the
Right.
last chapter is the one that's about success. And so where where I fall short in life, which I do across the board, as a professional, as a husband, as a father, somebody that's just living. There was a time where that, like the shame connected to that was really strong, and that shame would actually drive me further away from those things that I felt like I ought to do, because it's potent and it's sort of venomous. Now it's like, oh wow, this is an opportunity to learn about myself, because there's a reason I chose this path, and the reason is that the value proposition seemed better at the time that I took it. So with shame, when I feel shamed and I do something to feel better instantly, there was a value proposition that I accepted at that point, which is I could sit down and watch TV instead of going to the gym because that's going to feel better. And the truth is that
Mm-hmm.
in that moment, it absolutely did. That's absolutely a fact. Um, Part of what wasn't on the scales is how I would feel tomorrow. But what I get to learn about myself when I recognize a failure that I've experienced is what was the choices there? Why did that value proposition seem so good? What are some other things I could consider? And in letting myself off the hook for being good or bad all the time, doing this perfectly or doing it, not well enough, is that it's given me the opportunity to just be curious and be a student of life and a student of experience. And it makes life way more enjoyable to not always have to be, um, in pursuit of this sort of perfection. And if you ask me in a quiz, is perfection attainable? Of course not. But if you look at the actions I'm taking, uh, they look like actions of somebody trying to be perfect. So there's a disconnect in there somewhere. Um, it's not attainable for me. So the more sober that I am, the longer that I'm sober, and the more I consider what I want to be aiming at in my life experience. One of the most powerful gifts that I've been given is letting myself off the hook, and treating failure as an opportunity, and treating failure as the meat of the book. That's the
Yeah.
reason why people are successful is because they don't run away from their failures. They recognize their failures. That drives them deeper into looking for more appropriate solutions. That's the gift. That's a huge gift. And so when I consider the areas that I've been successful in my life, um, there's a story that leads up to that. And that story is about failure. And the
Yeah.
speed with which I get from the beginning of a quest to success is in direct proportion to the relationship I have to those failures. So we're talking about wrapping up here in a minute. This is probably as good a place to do that as any. Is that one of the things? There was a group of therapists had a meal here, and in that conversation, one of the questions that came up is, "Have you ever had a client that had a healthy relationship to failure?" And the table got completely quiet. There's 20 people here, people that dealt with every, sort of condition a therapist would deal with. And since then, I've asked that question to everybody that I've met professionally, and the answer is no. And so it's when I consider that more broadly, when I look at the guys who are coming in here, especially the younger generation of guys who are coming in here, um, the fear of failure is so deep, um, and that bleeds into their family. Their parents are terrified that this shit's going to go sideways, absolutely terrified that there's going to be failure. And so one of the big questions here is, how do you like introduce failure consistently, and introduce failure in a way to where it's okay. You get a two-year old falls on the ground, skins their knee. Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? And that's what the 2-year-old wants to know, right? The 2-year-old's not concerned with the scrape on their knee, most likely, unless it's really bad. But in most cases, they look at their parent, and then their parent's reaction tells them what just happened. And so if the parent's like, "Oh my God," that kid's crying, game over.
Mm-hmm.
More often than not, the parent looks down and says, "Okay, what's that?" Then the 2-year-old has to be like, "Well, I don't know what that is." I'm like, I think I got a scrape. Maybe I need to cry a little bit. Maybe I don't. Maybe I'm curious. Maybe I become enamored with the blood because I'm two. I don't know that that's a bad thing necessarily. And so part of what I want to do is have that same opportunity here for failure. consistently on a daily basis. I want the guys, the guy who runs our wood shop is a world famous woodworker. He's been at this for a very long time. He was apprentice under George Nakashima, who's like as renowned a American woodworker as there is. He fails regularly. I want guys to see that. I want that to be the invitation here is that like that's okay. Like it's okay to fail. I want to ensure in the staff here that when failure occurs, which is going to because we've tried to design it into the work that we're doing, that reaction isn't that gasp, that it's like, oh, okay, well, what is that? What are we doing with that? What are we doing with that now? We do work here that challenges me and challenges Andy, challenges Marcus. It's work that's just beyond our reach. And the reason why we're doing that is that one, I would not remain interested in the work that I do if we're making birdhouses, sort of paint by number type of work here.
Right.
The other thing is that it's important for these guys to see what somebody who is quote unquote successful, what happens when they fail? What happens when things go completely sideways? And sometimes we do that beautifully, sometimes we don't, but it's always up for discussion, right? If we fail and somebody loses the plot, one of the staff loses the plot, like that's not really a bad thing. It's an opportunity to really investigate who we are and how we deal with life as it comes and how we deal with the inevitability of failure. And I think those sort of relearning of something that simple, if what we know about success is that it's going to be 9 chapters of failure, like how do we do failure better? What does
I
that
hear
look
you.
like?
You just reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in forever. When I was 16, this would have been in 1993. I went on Outward Bound in Maine, and we were doing this exercise on a dock when I was in a group of probably 20 people, guys and girls, and I was, more one of the more athletic and coordinated and just a leader in this milieu, if you will. And we had this thing where they said, here are these ropes, figure out a way to get from this side of from this dock to the other over the water. So we all kind of put our heads together and made this rope thing. And every single person got across it on the first time except for me. And I fell in the water. And I remember being humiliated. And,
Uh,
and I was flopping around because it was Maine, it was freezing. But I remember on the spot saying, okay, you can cry like a baby or you can get up there and do it again. And I got up there and did it again. And I remember just being so proud of myself, not in the, the
yeah, yeah.
seven deadly sins way, but it's something I wasn't really able to implement much in my life until, I got sober, but I'm glad to bring that you inadvertently brought this up because I hadn't thought about that in such detail in a long time, but that's what it's all about. It's just getting back up and trying again and learning from our mistakes. Yeah.
Right. And if what we know about addiction is that it's chronic and there's a high likelihood of relapse, well, the question is care providers is not how do you avoid relapse? Although that's obviously the aim is to reach some sort of sustainable life. It's not about how do you create a life without conflict or a life where circumstances don't happen. It's not about how do you insulate somebody from these things. It's a question of like when those things come, who is going to show up to that? And as a care provider, how am I helping somebody grow into somebody that shows up to that in a way that generates life as opposed to generates death? That's it. So if
Right.
this was if we took all the morality and such out of addiction and we just looked at it like cancer, if it's the same thing, relapse happens. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to
Right.
set up some sort of system where we catch it before it becomes malignant? Or are we going to just hope it doesn't happen, and when it happens, just bug out and send somebody
Right.
into the throes of panic? And so it's
Right.
who are we going to be? Who are we creating? How resilient are the people that we're growing with? Are we creating resilience, or are we creating some sort of mythology about we're doing something that's never going to see failure? And so
Right. And
I
it's all
like it
about
the
that
other way.
value proposition.
Right,
Sorry,
right.
go ahead.
No, that's it. The value proposition I want to offer somebody is that you've got one stab at this thing, this strange, curious, magical, terrible gift of life. You got one shot at it. And somewhere inside of every single one of us is some sort of story about who we're supposed to be. And I think that's the point, is how do I become that person? Is really, that's my job. That's how I see my job here. Who do I become that person that there's this quiet little voice inside of me telling me to be? And when I arrived at sobriety, I knew that I couldn't be that person. There's this other curious part where I knew I would eventually be, but also that was, I thought a lot of things that were delusional, but I knew I didn't have the tools to become that person. And so in this idea of, somebody was talking to me about this when we saw each other this weekend, about the difference between a threat and a challenge. Is a threat is this thing that's coming to you that you don't have resources to overcome. And a challenge is this big thing that's coming at you, but you do have the resources to overcome, but it might be difficult, right? And so
Hmm.
on some level or another, when with the idea of can I become the person I was meant to be when I got sober, there was a threat connected to that for me because I knew I didn't have those tools. I knew I didn't have the resources to become that person. And so the value proposition that was given to me is basically like a man saw me and said, I think you can become that person. And he gave me some ideas of who that person might be based on his time with me. And then he invited me to supper. That was basically it. And invited me to suffer towards becoming that person. And that was a value proposition, is that I could actually exist with this really temporary gift and discover who that was and not be afraid of suffering, not be afraid that the pain would become too much, which it had been, at that stage in my life. The pain was too much. I was too sensitive to the world. The world chewed me up. And he gave me an invitation that said, I think you can be that person. And there's something when that bell rings, when somebody sees that picture that I'm the quietest voice in my head has of who I am, and somebody else sees that, says, this is who I think you can be. And I never told anybody who that person was. So I know he's not like, wow, he saw that. That was powerful. That was that was the value proposition for me at the beginning. That's what kept me through the times where on paper it would have been easier to get fucked up. Is that somebody gave me that value proposition, and I wanted somewhere deep down in my core to be that person, and I wanted to believe that the resources would be available to me to become that person. And lo and behold, over a period of time, it didn't look the way I thought it would look. But I was given those. I was showed up and followed the directions that he gave me on how to show up to that problem. And slowly over time, those resources became apparent, and they continue to be. And now the difference between me today and me at the beginning is that I believe the resources are coming. And so at the moment where I don't understand what the solution is to any one of the given failures that I'm facing today in my life, the difference is I know the solution's coming. I know that if I continue on the journey I'm on, the solution's coming. And I have to be patient, and I got to show up and chop wood and not be afraid to suffer, and also not be afraid to embrace the beauty and the magic and all those things in the meantime. Like, just because I don't have the answer now isn't doesn't tell me that I have to feel shame until that solution comes. It's that's not necessary. I can enjoy the magic in the meantime.
Awesome. Well, it's a great place to leave it. Jeremy, before we go, how do we find you? How do we find you, and how do we find Making Whole?
We're on the web, makingwhole.com. That's whole with a W. I think if you Google making HOLE, it's a different search criteria that you get. We're making whole on Facebook and Instagram. The way you find us, actually find out what this is about, is you just come eat lunch with us. Our address is on the website. And literally, you show up here at 12:30. The only thing you have to bring is an appetite, and we'll feed you.
Awesome. Food is great. It's a great hang. I've done it many times. And I look forward to seeing you up there in person soon. So just want
Yeah.
to say thank you again to Jeremy French of Making Whole, and we will leave it here.